Welcome, Matt. Welcome once again to this Journey Dialogues. And it's always a wonderful feeling. And I look forward to our exchanges. You've done almost 3 or 4 of them in the last few years. Thank you so much.
I am feeling a bit like a frequent guest. Thank you. It's been great to have the opportunity to do this a few times, and looking forward to this one and seeing where we go this time.
Yep. So Matt, I think it's interesting. I didn't prepare for this call. I thought that we would just be a little more spontaneous. What's emerging for me right now was you've seen quite a few decades. I think there are very few people who can say they've seen decades, and you've seen various aspects of our existence. And the key thing that was emerging for me was when we spoke last, you were about to come up with. I think you plan to come up with something for your clients where you try to draw different forces that are affecting or they should be affecting their businesses. So that was due in August last year. So would you be coming out with something like this again this year? And how are you thinking through that now?
Well, it's interesting. So I'll fully declare that the book that I've written is things are changing so quickly that I'm on my third or fourth manuscript of the book because between AI, coming out of COVID, political changes globally, etc., it just keeps getting more interesting. So I'm a bit behind actually in publishing the book, but we are making progress. So yeah.
Interesting. An interesting thing for me could be also if you can bring to mind what are the things that are getting more validated or reinforced, if there are some. What are the things that you're revising or there are revisions that you're undertaking? And what's ambiguous and confusing for you in the sense? So let's say there was something called as reinforced, something which is revisions, and let's say something which is very confusing. How would you respond to this?
Well, I think that it's interesting. So coming back to your telling me how old I am, I appreciate that. You're not so young yourself, my friend. But anyway, look, I think the reinforced to me really is that the laws of business are still quite valid, and we can't forget that cash is king, and we have to make more money than we spend, and we have to deploy capital efficiently, and it is really all about harnessing our limited resources to achieve outcomes, and often or always those resources include people. So making sure that we find that balance between capital human and capital money, and more recently capital technology is these are sort of universal truths. And I do remember way back in the dot-com sort of period when sort of 1999, everyone was in this exuberant phase where the laws of business don't apply anymore. And, that's not true. And here we are again with AI and other things happening where, fundamentally, I think people have gone around the corner a bit, and these rules that were established hundreds of years ago still largely apply. Okay, so that's my reinforce. I think for sure we can't forget the formula of business, right? Which is, you take capital, you transform that capital into value, that value is consumed, and doing that efficiently really matters, and doing it in a way that is competitive is obviously incredibly important. Okay, so that's not going to change. I don't think. I mean, maybe, but I doubt it. I think the surprise for me, if we go to the other end next, is, is this really a surprise? I think the surprise is just how fast it's all moving, right? So there's just a need to sort of keep up that felt like 5 years ago. It was crazy, and we were, kind of moving really quickly on a number of fronts. 10 years ago, not so much. 15 years ago, less so. Notwithstanding what I said a minute ago about the dot-com period, then the GFC, then COVID, now AI. You know what I mean? These cycles just keep coming, but these things might have come once every 50 years, and now they're coming once every 5 years, once every 2 or 3 years. I think it's a big challenge for leaders to stay ahead of it in the best of times, or just kind of hang on and keep up is very difficult. So from that point of view, I guess I'm surprised at how many leaders are just not able to cope with the ambiguity and the change. And at some level it's a surprise, and other levels it's just so much so fast. It's hard to maintain that. What was your third one? The one in the middle?
Yeah, so there was the revision, there was a reinforcement, there was a surprise or confusing.
Oh, the revision. Okay. Is there anything that I can think of that would be a revision to my original thinking or anyone else's thinking? Not particularly, really, to be honest with you. I think that those rules still apply. I think how you create value as a firm is never going to change. The mechanics or the tactics might change. Certainly technology has played a key role, but it's, in my view, really fundamentally, how do you use these things as resources and use those resources to transform value. I'll tell you though, what is interesting, and I don't know if it's a surprise or not, is the emerging dynamic between how people and technology have to work together, where I think, historically people have been the lords and masters of technology, and that seems to be inverting, or at least leveling at right now, where, we have to work side by side with the chatbot or with our AI brethren in a way that, we wouldn't have thought about not even half a decade ago. I mean, certainly in science fiction, it's always been envisaged, but now it's here and it's in business. And, you're talking to a chatbot virtually every day, or interacting with a chatbot, or interacting with your favorite AI. It's more and more becoming a human and technology coexistence, if you will. And that's really, really profound.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that, Matt, because I think in the last or a call before that, you had mentioned the great inversion, and you mentioned about two inversion. One is the inversion of relationship between the employer and the employee, and the inversion of relationship between the customer and the company, in the sense the brand. And I think in some sense right now you're also mentioning this inversion of relationship with technology. Are you seeing some kind of a pattern emerging out of this? Is there a meta inversion happening in some sense?
I'm a big follower of your sketches, right? So I love these things, and every time I get one, I really enjoy them. Is there a big pattern? I think the pattern is that a lot of the core baseline assumptions about how business and society works have or are in the process of flipping. You know what I mean? So we talked about, I think last time we spoke, we talked about how employees, like my dad worked at Kodak for almost 30 years, right? It was I'm going to be loyal to the firm sort of period. And now it's completely the other way around, where the firms are scrambling to be relevant and authentic to their people. And I was just reading a really interesting article the other day about Japan, how that's like the last place on earth where this is finally starting to unfreeze, where the salaryman or salarywoman in Japan is finally starting to work out that they don't have to be in the same company for life. You know what I mean? They don't have to sort of operate the way their ancestors did. I think it's the same with brands, but I think this emerging area of, people and technology, it's just that the technology is reaching a point where it's more and more, not quite, but it will be on a level playing field with people. And now we have to sort of discover, how do we interact with the technology in a way that is advantageous to everybody, including the technology, where, it's sort of historically, we would think of that as like almost an inert factor, but now it's, increasingly has a personality. It has a, I don't want to say a soul, but it's, it's sort of, it's tangible, and it's real in a way that it wasn't before. It's not just a utility, or increasingly it's not just a utility. But for me, and the work that I do, it's sort of like, as a leader, how do you sort of take these things and then understand the bigger pattern, to your point, and say, what does it mean for how I compete? And what does it mean for how I deploy my limited resources? And what does it mean for how I engage my people, or how I engage stakeholders, how I engage society, you know what I mean? And increasingly, how I engage with the political environment too. That's a factor that, was probably in the background always, but is much more front forward now in so many places, that it's harder and harder to ignore that factor in almost every aspect of your business. So I think that's interesting too. Long answer to your question. I think there's a lot of inversions, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think this is fascinating. I and again, this is just thought in progress. I'm just thinking, um, for a long period in human history, once agriculture started setting in, you had generations staying in a particular geography, and maybe, I'm just putting a speculation out, so I don't know the facts of it. But then you would have intergenerational transfer of knowledge, intergenerational transfer of social capital, uh, and some kind of belief system that would be more homogeneous than heterogeneous. And then over the period of industrialization, urbanization, globalization, virtualization, we're finding more and more people coming from very different belief systems. Uh, uh, or let me put it this way: people coming from heterogeneous belief systems with some commonalities and some differences, and they come together in this economic system to trade their skills in products and services. Uh, it is just a feeling that I have, again, without any rationality to it, that there is more and more of anonymity, with the anonymous talking to anonymous, anonymous interacting with anonymous, even if there are people saying that we know each other over a period of time. The inventory of behaviors available to each other over a period of time is not that much that was there maybe uh, in the earlier era. I don't know what point I'm trying to get at, but what I'm trying to say is, on one side there is this huge individualism that is there in the world, where the individual the can use their reason skills to do what they want in the world, and at the same time there is this deep instinct for belonging, uh,
Hmm.
belonging to something. Um, and for some time there was this belonging towards companies, and maybe that's shifting again. So I think we are in an era of a revision on a revised individualism and revised communityship, if I may use that word. Can you take this further, Matt? Because I'm just rambling with something that is just in my
No,
head.
I think it's very interesting, and I think about this a lot. I think there's, look, first, there's no doubt that, to your earlier point, that the mobility of resources and people and capital is a huge driver in all economies, right? And if you go back 500 years, when it was less mobile and more locally homogenous, but internationally um, more heterogeneous, right? You sort of look at it like that, where then what, 150 years ago, you had the railroads, and that, or maybe let's go back 300 years with shipping, and the world starting to open up, where essentially global trade was invented. That created a lot of political problems, certainly, and not, we could talk all about that. But then we had the railroads, then we had electrification, then we had internal combustion engine, so far and so on, right? So here we are. So There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that fluidity of knowledge, of cultures, of viewpoints have created a tremendous opportunity for innovation, and that's going to continue. But now we have like where before it was like a really viscous kind of before it was sort of like a low viscosity environment, and now a high viscosity environment. Now it's a low viscosity environment where it's more liquid than fluid. You know what I mean? It's sort of like it's these things are happening all the time. So I think your question is a really important and interesting one. I don't know how important it is or interesting for business leaders, but at a society level, this idea of balancing individualism with affinity, I think to me really explains a lot of what we're seeing politically, particularly where individuals who are often very forward in their advocacy of individual rights or individualism tend to be those who are highly affiliated to a group, which I don't know. I find it to be a very weird paradox. But that sort of, I think, kind of ties back to those inversions that we talked about, right? Because where inversion one, employee affinity to company, right? Where that sort of affinity has weakened, individuals' affinity to, say, their political tribe has strengthened. You know what I mean? So your hypothesis, the way you described it, I think, is that there will be always an affinity, but where it is and how it shifts, might be different. Affinity to country, I think, ebbed until quite recently, and now we have nationalism coming back. I don't think affinity to firm is increasing. I'm not sure about affinity to religion, for example. That seems to be increasing in some areas and decreasing in other areas. I think it's very interesting. I think for firms and particularly for leaders, because that's what I'm interested in, is coming back, is like really trying to understand what the pattern is. And for example, if you're segmenting your customer base and trying to figure out how to engage with them, I think that affinity is a really powerful lever, right? So if you're competing in America, for example, and you're not thinking about kind of red versus blue, you're really kind of missing something, right? It's like the leading demographic variable now. And whereas before we might have thought about sex or race or religion or age or whatever, those things seem to be less important to me maybe than this new variable or this more prominent variable, maybe it always existed. So I think that's really interesting. And then individualism, I think that sort of selfish motivation of individuals is also, I think, interesting for business leaders, in a sense of, if you view that we operate in a more transactional world, on one hand, in a world where affinity matters in another, how do you capture that transactional relationship in a way that creates enduring value? I think that's a tricky one for people where, we've just kind of, maybe we're coming to the end of the age of the subscription or the membership, right? Where we try to create this, to your point, we try to create this affinity to a cause or a mission or something like that, where we want people to come and engage with us and stay with us. And as business leaders, we want to extract lifetime value out of those relationships. But if we're inverting that again to be more transactional and individual, then some of those models start to break down maybe. And then we have to relearn how to engage in a more transactional environment. So I think that's interesting too. Like, how would you, it seems like we go through these cycles and phases, and we seem to be in one where all these sort of core assumptions are open for debate in maybe a way they weren't before.
Yeah. As you were leading this, Matt, I was just thinking, for a person who wants to work today, I mean, if we keep some factors aside, obviously they do play in, but if a person doesn't want to work in one company today, there is freedom of movement to move to another company and another company. So there is this freedom of movement available to the person. Same goes with customer. If you don't like a product, or if you don't like the company's ethos or promise versus delivery or whatever, you can move to
Sure.
another product. Investors too, I would say they can move from one company to another. Um,
That's never changed though, right? That's always been there.
Yeah, I just have a feeling that, and I don't know how to even wrap my mind around it. One is, if I look at Amazon today, it has millions of products, millions of products. If I look at job portals, they've got millions of jobs available. Uh, if I look at share trading or investments, there are millions of opportunities for investments. I'm just thinking that we are maybe becoming hunter-gatherer again of sorts, where we're not settling down. And the settling down was never a perfect settling down. It was, you remain unsettled, but you still are settled in some sense. And maybe we are unsettling again, but maybe this time it's slightly different because I don't know what's similar or different about this unsettling than it was earlier. Maybe if we can take a shot at that.
Look, honestly, I don't know how different it really is, right? I think we've always been hunter-gatherers, right? And there's just more opportunities to go hunting and gathering maybe than there were before. But I think maybe a couple things that are different is that increasingly the technology will be competing with us to hunt and gather. That's something new. We haven't experienced that before, right? We haven't had a kind of a, I'm going to push the analogy here, and I'm not suggesting this as it might sound crazy, but we've never operated as with a co-equal species, right? And now I'm not suggesting that AI goes that far, but you could extrapolate to say that under a number of circumstances that we'll be competing on the savannah for the for the grain and the meat with technology in more and more ways. So I think that is different, right? So before, technology was more about how do we to stretch the analogy even further, how do we hunt and gather more efficiently, right? Or how do we understand where the game is and where it isn't? You know what I mean? It's sort of efficiency and effectiveness. Whereas this is different, where we may be competing not just with ourselves, but with creations of our own minds for those resources. So I think that could be fundamentally different. The rest of it, I think, isn't that different, in a sense that what is really different is how quickly these things mobilize, and perhaps also the extreme concentration of probably the capital and the wealth that sort of follows that, which is, again, is that so different? I think different societies have gone through different periods of that concentration, and then, for various reasons, that scattered again and then reconsolidated. I think that's always been a pattern, but it feels like right now we're in a situation where that is all concentrating again. You mentioned Amazon. A few big platform players have a huge percentage of that market, right? And virtually every sector of the economy has those similar characteristics, where I'm in Australia right now, and we're one of the most, we have more oligopolies here than probably anywhere else as a percentage of our economy, right? Pick a sector, and there's two or three main players and a long tail of smaller ones behind that. It feels more and more anti-competitive, because those who gather the resources can consolidate that power, and those who have that power then are more appealing to a broader group of consumers, and that feeds on itself in a virtuous cycle that eventually creates kind of very high barriers to entry to everyone else. So that feels different, but I think it only feels different because we're in it right now and we're in the cycle. You know what I mean? But we could go back 500 years and see that that's been the pattern all along.
Right, right. Um, I I also feel the following. Maybe I don't know to what extent that could be weighed in the sense. Um, for a long period in human activity and human civilization, uh, a lot of people were occupied with doing something with their hands and legs, with their motor functions to do something with the physical substrate and create something. And obviously, we always had the supervisor, the managerial, the bureaucratic class. They were just different. And um, I have a feeling that uh, there's a lot of intangibility today in the world where so imagine the whole working class, the people who work. You have people who work and physically interface, do something physically, in the sense motor functions, or even customer service. A one-on-one customer service is a physical interface in some sense, even if it is virtual, let's say. But then there is a lot of abstraction class, I would say, people who are managing the front line, and then people who are managing the managers and managing the managers and managing the managers. And I just have this feeling that um, maybe we are also harvesting for allegiances and judgments of the intangibilities that people carry or ought to carry, and that could be slightly different in proportion, uh, is what I feel. And the second point I want to make is maybe we are not so trained in dealing with intangibilities. Uh, I just feel so. That how would you respond to something wild as this?
Wow, okay, that's a really interesting question. Here's a couple of thoughts, and I by no means an expert in this, right? So we do live in it. Let's agree that it's both intangible and ambiguous in a way that it hasn't been in the past. So tangibility comes with, structure and clarity, at least on the surface, right? So we also have this ambiguity. So when you start talking about ambiguity and intangibility, that puts you in a situation, particularly where we don't have any heuristics or patterns that we can apply to make decisions in intangible and ambiguous environments. Means that management and leadership um, has to create the scaffolding to make decisions in a way that perhaps they haven't had to in the past, right? So you don't have any um, you don't have as many anchor points to make those kinds of decisions, like where do I deploy the capital, or which market do I go into, or where do I make the investment in AI or other technology or whatever. So you don't have any precedent to sort of work from. So I think that is difficult for leaders. But for the rank and file, I think to your point, a couple of things that I would observe, and part of this is as a father, and part of it is watching the market, right? So here where I live anyway, and I don't know how it is where you are, but there's a huge deficit of people available to do that tangible work. So for example, plumbers, electricians, right? Builders, there are fewer and fewer of these people available. And consequently, um, I reckon my termite guy, the guy who comes and treats my house for termites, is more expensive per unit of labor than the most expensive lawyer here in Sydney. I'm not even exaggerating, okay? Um, there just aren't people that want to do that job. And he'll come and he'll say, I need to change all the termite traps around your house. And let's say there's 15 or 20 of them, and it's 2 or 3 minutes to unscrew the top, put the poison and the wood in. And that man it's a 20-minute job. He'll charge $2,000 or $3,000 for that job.
Wow.
Okay. Now I could go down the street and I wouldn't pay the best lawyer in town $2,000 or $3,000 for 20 minutes. You know what I mean? It's like this weird, that's an inversion too. Like, wow, but that's really just supply and demand, right? So where the tangible now is becoming valuable again, which is great. But in the same breath, I'll talk about my son who is studying sound engineering and music production, right? And he's profoundly worried because the technology can do virtually everything that he is studying, right? He's like, Dad, in 5 years, I'm going to be totally obsolete. Why am I spending all this money on university for this right? Because the robot is going to do this work and I'm going to be out of work and I'm still going to have to pay this debt back. So, he might not be happy with me telling the story, but he's actually looking at becoming a fabricator or an auto mechanic, saying, people are always going to drive cars and you're always going to need to build stuff. And I really like doing that too. My passion, my love is music, but I like working with my hands. So, but I can see now that there might be more value here in doing this. So I think that's terrific in a sense that, that invisible hand in the economy helps us deploy that capital. And it's one of those things that has never changed. And that's a human capital thing. But flipping it back to what you said before about, the intangibility of it all, let's be honest, there are huge amounts of people that have shifted to, especially this digital native generation, who don't want to work with their hands. They want to be influencers, they want to code, or they want to do this, that, or the other thing. I think that's exciting too, in a sense that these whole new sectors of the economy that didn't exist 5 years ago now are, if not prevalent, they're certainly growing like crazy. Like, who would have ever thought that you could make a living as a YouTube influencer, right? 5 years ago. Now, kids will go through school and, that's what they want to do. Whether they're living the van life thing or I don't know. I just find it fascinating. I have a friend who actually was on our podcast a little while ago, and he's just quit a pretty high-profile consulting job. He was an AI startup founder in the healthcare sector before that, and now he's a full-time YouTube influencer, primarily focused on AI and machine learning and the if you will, the behavioral economics of that whole transition. So it's all very interesting. But again, to me, that's fine. But what does it mean is the question. And then how do I apply that learning, having observed that, to how do I behave differently to make my company, my society, my family more effective, right? And so when you talked before about working with your hands and intangibility, one thing I think is really interesting is that, and I always talk to CEOs about this, right? Like, a question that comes up to me is like, how many of your employees have at least one other side hustle, right? And they'll look at me like, what are you talking about? And I always say to them, I will bet you that more than 50% of your workforce has at least one, if not two, side hustles or gig work outside of their main role, working with you as an employer. No way, no way. And then you'll get the leadership team together, 5 or 6, 7, 8 people. How many of you have a side hustle? This is the C level, the C-suite. The CFO might say, "Oh, I do this," or "I'm on 2 boards," or this, that, or the other thing. Now I said, now extrapolate that down to everyone in your business has some other way they participate in the economy, which has nothing to do with you. Then you talk to the chief people and culture person and say, what are you doing to facilitate your employees being able to work outside of the structure of your business? And the answer 99 times out of 100 is nothing. We're aware of it. We don't like it. We're not going to facilitate that. And I like to get people to flip these assumptions on their head and say, okay, now, why not? Why aren't you making it easier for others to work outside? Isn't it going to make them more loyal to you, or isn't going to, reducing the friction of their ability to work? No, I want them in the office, or, I want to track how many minutes they're on the computer. I think it's really interesting. So for me, the business leader, tangible, intangible doesn't matter. What matters is outcomes, and then how you manage that ambiguity in a flexible way to create the best possible experience for people, which then delivers more benefit to everybody. That's got to be the mindset.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned that, Matt. Yeah.
Well, let me flip it on you. Like, what you're doing this all the time, speaking with different people. What are some of the interesting patterns that come to your light over the last, say, 6, 12 months? And, like, maybe put 1 or 2 of them into the discussion here, and maybe we can see how they come together.
Yeah. So what I hear you say is I speak to these people, and then maybe if I picked up some pattern or they have cited certain patterns, can we bring them in here? Is what you
Mm.
say. Yeah. So I think one interesting conversation that stands for me is one that I had with two actually. One is I had with Margaret Heffernan. Uh, I think she's written a few bestsellers, including something called as Willful Blindness and Uncharted. She's largely talking about that there's a certain set pattern that management believes that the management needs to be doing, uh, and that needs to go out of the window now because the era of longer runway certainties and predictabilities are over. And when she cites that, she also cites artists as a category to learn from, because she believes that a true artist, a passionate artist, constantly leans into uncertainty. Without leaning into uncertainty, you cannot come up with something interesting. And I think what happens in businesses nowadays is more of reproduction of habits, biases, system one. Uh, it happens always like this, and all of that. So that's an interesting thing that I. And she's also asking us all to be aware of. We all want to create a mental model of each other to be able to do something with each other. And what we end up doing is this whole thing of becoming individual brands, so that we want to be boxing each other into certain categories to be able to deal with. And she believes that the true living of life would mean that you unbox yourself, you unbrand yourself ever so often, and discover something which you have not discovered early. And that's the only way you can build muscle towards uncertainty. How does this speak to you?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think, we do a lot of work in my firm in innovation, right? And, these established patterns, both socially, from a social point of view, like how you interact with each other, um, maybe using your two by two sort of, schema, your social interactivity, right? And then your interactivity with the world of work creates these really strong biases that makes it incredibly difficult to break open new thinking. And then when you have a whole group of people sort of trapped in that sort of lower, that lower quadrant, even harder to get them out, right? So I completely agree with that idea. And I think that sort of then speaks to like, what are the kinds of talent that we want, right? Do we want people that are good at doing the same thing over and over again? Um, or do we want people with adaptive capabilities that can sort of almost shed their skin in one moment and put a new skin on in the next moment? It's almost like, how do I adopt it's how do you teach people to adopt a new persona depending on the situation that they're in, or even a new persona in a situation that's very familiar, right? And then in adopting that new persona, sort of abstracting yourself away from the bias and then finding opportunities then to challenge the way you might think. You know what I mean? Which is really difficult when you're, let's say a young person in a management meeting, who doesn't feel comfortable to speak up, has a completely different view, or even worse, that young person's not in the management meeting because only the people with the seniority are in the management meeting. So that individual doesn't get a chance to kind of bring that thinking in. You know what I mean? And I always say to people, never underestimate the power of a really, really stupid question, right? The question that no one else would think to ask, like the dumbest question ever. I'll give you an example. I ran an innovation workshop with a huge group of insurance brokers maybe 18 months ago, right? And I opened this up with, I want everyone in here. This is probably 75 people, right? So I started this 2-day thing with this group by getting them to articulate what's the stupidest possible question or stupidest possible thing that we could do differently to grow. And the stuff that came out was really stupid. except for two or three things that people are like, that's not stupid at all, right? One of them was really fun, which was, why don't we send all of our clients let's send all of our clients handwritten letters, ha 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 ha, right? Like, you know what? No one else is doing that, right? Why is that a stupid thing? Well, we would never do that. We want to send emails, blah, blah, blah. So, this sort of evolves, and it's like, okay, well, maybe there's something there. But it's just, the point is that we often don't give ourselves permission. Winding back 20 minutes to our conversation about affinity, that plays a key role there too, because you don't want to break from the tribe. And if you break from the tribe, all of a sudden you're on the outside, and that creates a very uncomfortable space. You know what I mean? And it's weird because especially younger people, whilst they seem like they're not with the tribe, they're just not with our tribe because they're younger, but there is a social order to their own tribe, and breaking outside of that can be very dangerous to them, right? Particularly in the digital social world that they tend to more live in a way that even in our, we grew up in a different world a little bit. I'm a Gen X, so maybe one foot in each camp, but the world that we grew up in was kind of very temporary social isolation, but digital isolation is very different, right? So you don't necessarily get that, people stepping out too far sometimes. And then I think also we're not educating people the way that we used to, right? So people have to take more responsibility for their own education because our institutions aren't giving them what they need. And consequently, very few people can sort of, coming back to your original point, like I do 10 minutes later, very few people can live in that sort of, again, ambiguous world, but with adaptive capability that allows them to enter a situation, put on a different persona, adapt to that situation in a way, apply different skill sets, or even assemble different skill sets, which they don't have. Could be tech, could be other people. That sort of that individual assembler is like the unicorn of talent that we're always looking for, but they're very difficult to find. But we're not really training people to be like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're not training people to be like that at all. So then you talk to your author, and that's like a big pattern, but that's like a Six Sigma person who can see that pattern, right? But most people can't.
Yeah. So many things. I'm glad that you prompted, sort of a human chat GPT prompt you gave to bring in other thinkers into the conversation. It's just exploding, and the way you were speaking, there's so many things that have come up for me. So thank you so much for that. A few things that I would put on the table. I'm reminded of E.O. Wilson, actually, one of his famous quote. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And to your point of institutions not doing, or institutions actually playing catch up to the happenings in the world, maybe, yeah, I think, and that's why I also feel somewhere when I speak to a lot of people, except for a certain kind of people, most people have developed general institutional disdain somehow. Whether it's a company or a political establishment or even administration in a government. So that's rising somehow. I feel there is a general institutional disdain that's not good for civilization, I believe.
I completely agree with you. And I think, and it's hard to put your finger on what people are pushing back against. It's sort of like they often feel like these institutions either aren't serving them or somehow they're not efficient, and therefore their contributions are being wasted. Or maybe it's much more selfish than that. Often people don't want to put their own money into institutions that help other people. That really worries me, right? Like, profoundly worries me. But your point's absolutely correct. Like, these institutions have not kept pace, right? And some of these institutions are by design very slow changing because they live in a political sort of environment, which then, the people who create these institutions and sustain them will often be, they're almost all a compromise between multi sort of, in politics, it's parties, in business, it's factions, whatever it might be. So you end up with in many cases, the lowest common denominator that does the least amount of harm. You know what I mean? As compared to something that's really dynamic. And it's difficult to build something that's dynamic unless there's extreme crisis or pressure, in which case then you can sort of unravel some of the rules and apply them a little bit more liberally. But in a sort of steady state environment, these institutions are meant to be quite solid and enduring, but consequently are very difficult to reprogram when things are changing all over the place. And I think that's in part why people don't trust them, because they're not keeping pace. And they also don't trust them because, of the other things that we've talked about, is this balance of affinity and tribalism versus individualism. These are factors which then kind of speak more to almost a very scary thing that seems to be happening, where you see people who are particularly online arguing a particular point, and then you wonder, is that person actually going to help the old lady up off the street if she trips over and falls down? You know what I mean? Like, the humanity of it really concerns me. So we have to work harder on that. We have to build more durable. We have to inbuild flexible but durable institutions, and we have to discover how to do that. And I don't think we're really anywhere near that yet. And even trying to think of an example where any institution has that characteristic to it. I don't know if you can think of any, but they're probably all under threat at some level.
Yeah, I am unable to. In fact, I completely agree. In fact, I'm just thinking that the human being who turns into a consumer for an organization, the human being is having his own set of issues, his or her own set of issues of the world and everything. But then the person is also the consumer, and the organization wants to harvest the consumer identity of the person. And then there is the organization that wants to harvest the employee identity of the person. And in both the consumer and the employee identities, there are changing preferences, or I won't commit loyalty preferences, sort of, for most people. And then I'm just wondering, what could be some of the interesting principles for organization to design the organization that could help them deal with tech disruption, geopolitical issues, consumer changing preferences, employee changing preferences. What could be some of the design principles that could come up?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, it's something we might have talked about 2 or 3 episodes before. I think that for the company or the firm, right? So the way a firm was, the definition of a firm, but the principles underpinning a firm, is a leader at the top of a big pyramid with the kind of a core assumption that the most efficient way to run that firm is to specialize in different functional areas and have each of those specializations do that work in a very repeatable and reliable fashion, stitch it all together into a kind of a command and control environment, right? So, that's kind of the, whether it's a company or a government institution, that's how we create organizations, particularly as they scale, right? But I guess if we live in this world where things are changing really quickly, I'd say principle 1 for me is aim the design of your business at the consumer and not at the CEO, right? Which then says, okay, some of these roles start to invert, right? Rather than everyone reporting to the CEO, the flip is, how does the CEO move around the business, unpicking bottlenecks that prevent value from reaching a consumer? How does the board provide more support to the CEO and the business to do that, rather than, or in addition to, just doing the governance, right? So when you start thinking that way, okay, now let's say we've just given ourselves permission to reinvent how a firm it works or how any institution works, then, right? You would say that, how do I decentralize those activities in such a way where value can be assembled and disassembled at some scale to achieve an outcome for a consumer with some level of efficiency in terms of how these component pieces are assembled? And then almost literally in the next moment, you blow that all apart and reconfigure it again and again and again and again. And then if you say, okay, is a firm a group of people? Is it a group of people with jobs? Or is a firm more of an idea of how do we assemble talent and capital to achieve an outcome? In which case, then you say, if it's the latter, then the insight becomes that the boundaries of the firm, they don't really exist at the interface between an employee and a non-employee, right? The people with adaptive capability, as I described a moment ago, inside the firm, their main job is to assemble talent, capital, technology, and other resources to achieve some outcome, some of which may be inside the firm and most of which might even be outside. You know what I mean? So then you keep extrapolating that and say, okay, keep unpicking that. And then you start to get a sort of a pattern of what the firm of the future might be, which is maybe relatively few people orchestrating the capital and the talent and all these things to achieve these outcomes. But then, sort of working across all sorts of other different parts of the economy. Now that exists at some level, but there's very high friction, right? So if you're in a firm and you're trying to run a procurement process for someone to do to build some technology for you, that's a slow process. It goes to legal, the financial people look at it, the contract people review it, procurement gets their hands on it, right? It's like, let's just get to work. You know what I mean? It's like, it's very, very uncomfortable and very slow. And then you start to understand, well, why don't these institutions work? Well, because they all work like that in every aspect. You know what I mean? So if you're going to design a firm from a clean sheet, those principles of like horizontal, not vertical, adaptive capability as opposed to functional capability, and so on and so forth, you'd start to really see something that's quite different. And then if you sort of extrapolate that again to an institution, right, where a healthcare is probably my most interesting one. Like if you think about just how inefficient healthcare is, and why is it inefficient? Well, there's lots of reasons. Part of it is that the widgets, which are the people, they have not just, it's just one widget that looks like every other widget. Even though they're human beings, you have tens of thousands of conditions and diseases and things like that all look very different, right? So how do you it's like any manufacturing system. If you have one widget that looks like every other widget, it's pretty easy to set up and, you can optimize that. When you have a million widgets that all look a little bit different, it's very inherently sort of inefficient, right? So, I think that whole system, for the most part, needs to be reimagined so that much more of the resource is earlier in terms of preventing the condition in the first place. Much more of the resource needs to be at the interface between the patient and the practitioner, right? And much less at the top of the pyramid, right? And so on. So you start to think about, like, how do we change how these things work? And then if you think about the leadership, like, what's the bottleneck in the system? Okay, well, we're not minting enough new nurses and doctors. Okay, well, now how do we work with the policy settings to make sure that that bottleneck is lifted? What's the next bottleneck? The next bottleneck is that, drug prices are too high. Why are they too high? We don't have economies of scale in purchasing. Okay, let's fix that. You know what I mean? It's sort of like taking that theory of constraints view of the whole thing, but then consider how the whole system is aimed at the patient as opposed to the shareholder, if you will, which tends to either be a government or, a traditional shareholder.
Right.
You understand my point?
Yeah, this is so fascinating, Matt, and a few things came up as you were speaking. I do remember now that in one of the episodes you talked about the CEO should become more of a chief bottleneck removal officer,
Hmm.
constantly identifying and prioritizing, choosing your battles rather than fighting all battles at the same time and having a different approach. The second thing that came up for me was, since you mentioned healthcare, I don't know whether you've come across the work of Frederick Laloux. He's written a book called Reinventing Organizations.
I have to admit, no, I have not come across it.
Okay, I think you might find that book interesting because it's some of the principles that you mentioned are close to the principles that he's mentioned in his book. And in his book, he's talking about a particular healthcare company, a home nursing company in Belgium, I think, which is completely decentralized structure. It's completely decentralized. It's called Boodzo. If I'm not, I may not be getting the pronunciation right of the organization. So that's an interesting case of a healthcare organization inverting their whole thing, and so you have decentralized teams managing their consumer or rather patient uh, portfolio. The last thing that came up for me was very recently I started reading this book called forgetting the name, but by Henry Mintzberg. uh, Henry Mintzberg has written a book in which he actually very interestingly talks about four kind of organization design or structure. One he talks about is a program structure where a lot of things which can be repeated and reproducible can be put as a program. The other is a project design. Project design is you assemble teams, you complete the project, then you disassemble. Third is, which is to your point of healthcare. He says healthcare is more of a professional services at its core because the patient needs to be attended by somebody who's technically qualified to attend to the patient. So you design a structure where the core structure is around the professional service, and then every other layer could be either program or project or ad hocism, as he calls it. So the fourth structure is ad hocism, and it's interesting to look at these structures, and they're in line with what you mentioned to some extent. So these things were coming up for me as you were speaking.
I think the term is adhocracy, right?
Okay.
So, yeah. And I'm trying to think of which Mintzberg book it is. I've read most of them years ago, but I think that is really interesting. But again, so to me, like the way you think about a problem like that is to completely break it open. So the answer, I don't think, would be to, at least in my opinion, would be less about creating a fixed team, okay, and more about how to assemble an ecosystem. Okay, so for example, I think that nurses and pharmacists are an underutilized part of the healthcare chain. Now, they have different, and I'm not going to say less valuable because their training is different, but there's a lot more that nurses could do and a lot more that pharmacists could do to alleviate the pressure, for example, on traditional healthcare practitioners. Okay. But because, to your earlier point, these are very well established tribes that have very high barriers to entry, there's a resistance of the medical colleges all over the world to open up more of the care to other parts of the ecosystem. You know what I mean? Which, in my opinion, creates a bottleneck and makes the whole system less efficient than it otherwise could be. You see my point? So if you're going to organize that way, organizing that in such a way that it leverages all the available resources in the system, maybe even including the family or other kind of allied health or maybe not less traditional Chinese medicine, whatever it might be, maybe that's more helpful than it is to create a clinical team of 5 or 6 traditional practitioners, which includes, let's say, a general practitioner, the specialist, you know what I mean? The people you'd expect to see in there. And I'm sure there's good reasons why they're in there. And I'm not a doctor, but I am a systems expert in a sense that, how do you increase the throughput of the system is important. And I think probably in healthcare more than any other space, we don't have open thinking that allows us to better consider how to leverage different aspects of what could be a wider ecosystem to help patients kind of experience better care and certainly better health outcomes. And importantly, on a lower cost curve than the current system, because the current system is so hierarchical, it creates profound, really profound constraints that prevent people from navigating that system. It's actually not that hard to fix, I don't think. The hard thing is to change the mindsets, not actually to change the system, I think.
Right. Matt, I realize we've reached the time that you had allocated. Would you have another 5-10 minutes? Can we go or?
Sure.
Okay. So there's something that was emerging as you was sharing the previous build up to what we were saying. Here is how I'm trying to think this through. When we had democracy on the planet, the idea was that, of course, there are competing ideas of why we had democracy and how it got created and stuff. But I think what has happened is, in the public space, we tried installing democracy for some kind of representation or participation in the key decisions, either directly or indirectly through some actors. But when it came to governments, I think we again created empires where within the organization, if an organization were a nation, we are having a very high, or rather very maximum state, minimum liberalism in some sense. And maybe people want to assert that back and want more liberty inside the nation called the organization, and they want minimum government in the organization. What does this metaphor appeal to you?
It does, and you always have to be careful in these sorts of environments not to get too political, right? So I think that really is a tension, right? So one popular theory in Western governments now is the unitary executive theory, right? Which is that the country should be run more like a CEO and more power should be concentrated into the CEO. But it's interesting, those same people that believe in that believe that individual liberty should be optimized. And I find that those are in conflict at some level. You know what I mean? Like, it's exactly the same principle I described before, is like, what are you solving for? Are you solving for concentrating the power into the executive so you can get things done more quickly? But I think, as we've already discovered, that top-down concentration of power doesn't necessarily make the system more efficient or more adaptable, right? Especially in the long run, because it's really reliant on, there's too many things for too few people to be able to absorb and then sort of dictate. And then the second big factor, obviously, is it requires really good people. And those people have to be good every time. And as soon as you get one that's not good, it creates a lot of chaos, right? So I think that's a real problem for me. But it's sort of like the idea of democracy is sort of seems to be built around this idea of freedom, right? And I'm going to make a controversial sort of argument here that freedom is a pretty big illusion, right? So if you're born in India, say, right, you're born already with obligations, okay? One obligation is obligation to country, right, which is loyalty. And if you're found to not be loyal, the worst case, you might be executed, which is not great. You know what I mean? So you carry that obligation is right out of the gate. You carry that. So you're free to do anything you want as long as you're not disloyal to the place where you were born, which was an accident to begin with, right? So then the second thing, you're obligated to pay taxes, right? There's no scenario in which you can exist without paying taxes, because as soon as you enter the economic flow, you're going to be taxed somewhere, okay? What happens if you don't pay taxes? Again, you get punished, okay? Third thing is then you have to follow the laws of the country that you're in, okay? So those laws on day one of your existence have all been decided before you were born by your ancestors. You had no agency in those laws. Now you have agency on the margin to change some of those laws as you go through, but it's relatively limited, right? So I would say that those three things are big constraints to individual freedom. So now I'm not saying that you can't have the illusion of freedom, but within those constraints, coming back to your point, is like, what are we solving for? If we're solving for what's the system that enables the most people to experience the most possible liberty without doing harm to their, to the environment, to their peers, etc. Right? I think that's kind of what we're trying to get to, or what many people are trying to get to. And then what's the most efficient system to enable that, right? I think Churchill said it really well that, democracy is the worst possible system except for all the others, or something similar to that, right? In some ways, at least that system does allow ebbs and flows and evolution to, sort of migrate to a more, I don't know, they say the more perfect union. I don't know if I really buy into that, but I don't think autocracy or concentration of power allows for that flexibility in the middle or the long term. And in the short term, certainly, I think one of the things that attracts people to that sort of system of government, or even system of the firm, is in the short term, all other things equal, an executive that knows exactly what they want to do and doesn't have to deal with any bureaucracy or any outside influence can make decisions relatively quickly and bring those decisions to fruition. But in the long term, virtually every time that goes off the rails.
Right. This has been, I have more questions, but I also am mindful of the time. Maybe I'll seek some other convenient time from you and we can continue our chat. But this has been
Sure.
absolutely fascinating, Matt, like every other time. So I'm deeply grateful to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me, and always a pleasure. So now I might ask you to return the favor and have you come and join our podcast at some point.
Oh,
Maybe
sure.
I'll grill you on, what have you learned? Because, as you can see here in my background, the insurgent mindset, our podcast is really about helping leaders to develop and evolve a challenger mentality, challenger mindset, and how do you break these patterns is really something I'm very interested in.
Would be honored to do that, Matt. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Terrific. All
Thank
right,
you.
great.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye.